Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast from Bama 247. I'm your host, Cody Goodwin. Going to do something a little different on this Sunday podcast. We are going to talk some Tide hoops. The Alabama men's basketball program begins a very highly anticipated 2024-25 season tomorrow, Monday, November 4th, against UNC Asheville. That game set for tip 8 p.m. Central. Game's going to be on ESPNU if you can't get to Tuscaloosa for it. What I thought we'd do today, since the football program is finishing out their bye week, we usually take these Sunday podcasts to recap whatever games are going on. Instead, I figured we could take today's show to preview this highly anticipated Alabama men's basketball season, right? Crimson Tide, fresh off of their first Final Four in school history, come back with big expectations for the 2024-25 season. They're currently ranked number 2 in the Associated Press preseason basketball poll. There's a lot of experts and prognosticators that anticipate the Crimson Tide will not only make another run to the Final Four, but could quite literally contend for a national championship this season. They did well in the portal, bringing in guys like Cliff Amore, Aiden Holloway, Chris Youngblood, Houston Millette. They did really well bringing back returning guys like Mark Sears, Grant Nelson, Jaron Stevenson, even tested the NBA waters. And they also brought in the number 2 ranked recruiting class in 2024 with some instant impact guys like LeBaron Philon, Darion Reed, and more. Going to be a lot of talent on this roster, going to be an exceptional schedule that Alabama is going to play to get you guys kind of up to speed on what to expect from Tide hoops this winter. Brought on Isaac Trotter, who's a national college basketball writer for both 24/7 and CBS Sports. Isaac does a great job of just making sure he understands the lay of the land, whether it's the SEC, Big 12, Big 10, wherever. Excellent basketball mind. So I brought him on. We talked for almost 45 minutes about Alabama. We discussed Nate Oates and what he's been able to do since becoming the head coach of the program in 2019. We talked about the roster that he was able to put together for this season, from the returners to the transfers to the freshmen. We also talked a little bit about the schedule, kind of what to expect around the SEC this season, and also realistic expectations for the Crimson Tide this 2024 season. It is a excellent conversation. I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. So let's go to Isaac now. As promised, Isaac Trotter, national basketball writer, college basketball writer for 24/7 Sports and CBS, here to talk some Tide hoops. Isaac, we don't usually talk Alabama basketball this early in the calendar. It's literally November 1st as we're recording this. The show will come out on Sunday, the day before their season opener. But this is a pretty special Alabama team. Before we even dive into the Crimson Tide in general, this has to feel like Christmas for you, man. I know we just got done with Halloween, but like college basketball season's literally on deck. I looked, there's like 100 games on the schedule on Monday. I see your smile getting bigger. Like what's it like this type of year for you, man?
It's go time, baby. Here we go. Like, it's all of these times where I always think about this part of season is like talking season. I am so ready for talking season to be over. We could get into the real basketball. We could start to have some questions answered. And, it's fun. Is Alabama basketball school now? I think we might have to have that conversation a little bit different. But you look at this roster. I mean, is this the deepest team in college basketball? I think you could certainly make that case. And, it's just so funny. It wasn't that long ago. I'm in Chicago at the NBA draft combine talking to Mark Sears. And he's like, yeah, I think I'm going to stay in the draft. I think I am. He had to miss a day of one of the first day of scrimmages, a little beat up. And he was like, oh, I'm going to stay in the draft. And then a couple of days later, boom, Mark Sears back to Alabama and national title contenders. Like, yep, there we go. So it's funny how life works in college basketball, just never changes.
This Alabama men's basketball team, fresh off the first Final Four in school history, there's a lot of heavy expectation, a lot of excitement. We've routinely called it the most highly anticipated season probably in program history coming up for 24-25. They're ranked number 2 in the AP preseason poll. They've been picked to win the SEC. Jerry Palm was just reading his bracketology this morning, has them as the number 1 overall seed in his bracketology. I know it's November 1st, so why not discuss bracketology, right? But you even put Alabama in that tier 1 in terms of true national championship contenders. Just before we really dive into some of the details here, what do you really like about this Alabama team? What are some just kind of early season thoughts about just the way the Tide's been constructed, what they could potentially do this year?
Yeah, no, I think the teams that I keep like wanting to invest in are the ones who can score at an elite level. I think, you hear that phrase in the back of your head, like, oh, defense wins championships. That's not the case anymore. Offense wins championships now. You have to score at an elite rate in order to do that. Alabama can certainly do that. So it's like, okay, we got a little splash of retention. We got a little splash in the portal of guys that we like. We got a couple freshmen that we like coming in. But we have this identity offensively of who we are, what we can be, and our process offensively. Alabama is going to win the math pretty much every night offensively because they take better shots than more of their opponents that they take. And those are the type of leveling up. And I think an underrated part of this too is, and another reason why I'm really bullish on this group is they kept the staff together a little bit similar to like what we've seen with UConn and their dominance. They haven't had these assistants leave and they're able to keep this band together. Alabama has been able to do that. So if you're looking at this roster, it's like, okay, we have maybe one of the deepest rosters. We have maybe one of the top 2 or 3 coaching staffs in the country. We have an NIL budget that's gotten way, way better after that Kentucky interest in Nate Oates. You're able to get that NIL budget boosted up a little bit. And now we have a roster that has a lot of outs. This is what a national championship contender looks like. And Alabama is going to head into this season with super high expectations. And they should. Like this, that comes with the territory when you put a roster like this together and you're able to retain your staff when, numerous high major programs would have loved to poach an assistant or two.
You look up and down this roster and we've talked to the guys kind of on and off over the last month or so, and they have not shied away from those heavy expectations, right? Mark Sears, when he said he's coming back to Alabama, I want to come win a national championship. Jared Stevenson, who also went through the NBA draft process, we talked to him yesterday. Yeah, I wanted to come back and win a national championship. You asked some of the transfers that came in, guys like, Cliff Amore from Rutgers, like, yeah, I saw where I fit in the process of things to help this team win a national championship, right? Like that's the goal, right? And I think it was even, Latrell, right? So earlier this year, he was like, we've got 4 goals this season. We want to win the Players Era. We want to win the SEC regular season. We want to win the SEC tournament, and we want to win the NCAA tournament. So this is not a team that is shying away from it. And that's kind of exciting, right? Because I know that's, you mentioned it too. We hear a lot of that with football, right? Like that's just, it's national championship or bust almost every year. But with basketball, you don't always hear that. But I feel like there's just been an evolution within the program where it's like, yeah, like we can compete. We've got the dudes. We've got the coaching staff. We know we can do that. And that's where I think like the Final Four run last year really kind of solidified everything for Nate Oates, for his system, for the players on the roster, for guys that want to come join, whether it's as a recruiter or a transfer. Like there's just a lot of good things going for this program right now.
Well, and the one other thing I like about it is that like you can't just like copy paste this season and be like, boom, Alabama's going to be in the Final Four next year. Like you can't, like you have to let this process play out. Like the NCAA tournament is the most random event that we have in sports. Baseball, basketball, football, you can't find one that's more random. Weird things happen in that tournament. So you can't just automatically pencil you in. And that's where it's like this beauty of this long season with some of these new faces that are really hungry. Like, I don't think you're going to have a team that's just going to be coasting through the regular season being like, all right, let's just get to Selection Sunday. Let's just get ourselves a decent seed. And then the real season starts. Like, no, like this starts right now. And this matters right from the beginning because there's a lot of guys. I mean, you have 13 players here who all think that they could be either starters or rotation players. And so the battle for minutes, the fight for minutes, the fight to make money at the NBA and even more in the NIL in the short term, like all of that stuff matters right now. And I think that competitiveness on the inside is going to make this, I don't think there's going to be this like complacency in this group where it's like, oh man, we just got to get through the dog days of January and February so we can get back to the NCAA tournament. Like that's the special part of putting a roster like this together because you're literally fighting for your spot like every single day in practice.
Nate has talked about that too, just like, hey, we're going to have to figure out a way to ration minutes. He even hinted at potentially redshirting some guys because there may not be enough minutes to go around, and he probably wants to sustain this thing, not just have a special season one-off. He wants to keep this thing rolling. The other thing too about, hey, this thing starts now, that there are no dog days in January and February. Alabama's schedule, we'll get into this, doesn't really allow for that because Nate's a little bit of a psychopath just in terms of who he's scheduling, but then also the rise of the SEC has been impressive to watch as well. Before we dive into the roster and the schedule a little bit, I wanted to start with I wanted to get some of your thoughts on Nate Oates, right? His story has been well told by now, right? He spent a decade at Romulus in Detroit, jumped to Buffalo, became the head coach, came to Alabama in 2019. Since then, 117 wins, 4 NCAA tournament appearances. They've won the SEC regular season twice. They've won the SEC tournament twice. They were the number 1 overall seed a couple years ago. They got to the Final Four last year. Just what's impressed you the most about what Nate's been able to do at a school that has some basketball history, but really not a ton? And he's really turned them into a, especially of recently, I don't want to say powerhouse, but like Alabama's been a really, really good program the last few years.
Yeah, he's cemented himself as one of the best coaches in the sport. We're doing our top 25-1 coaches at CBS, and it's like, all right, number one is Dan Hurley because they won 2 titles. Number 2, we probably should go with Bill Self because of the pedigree. Number 3 is probably Kelvin Sampson because of what he's done at Houston. And then it's like, well, Nate Oates is probably number 4. Like the fact that he has elevated into that type of conversation, like ahead of some of these longtime stalwarts, like a Tom Izzo, like a Mark Few, guys like that. Like we're just putting him ahead of those guys easy. That just is stunning to me. And I think there's some faith here that he's shown in this Alabama ecosystem that we can win big here, because that Kentucky job, like I think that if he told you honestly, I think he probably did think about going to a job like that. Like, why wouldn't you? It's Kentucky. So for him to stay is a big bet on this Alabama ecosystem that I can accomplish everything that I want here. And I think that teams are going to continue to start calling for him. I think NBA teams are going to continue to start calling for him eventually too. And he's going to have to answer those things down the road. But for now, he thinks Alabama is the place that he can win big, and that he has been given the resources to go do that. So I think it's really, really impressive. I think it is. And I think this is also one of the years where it's like, hey, now you're the hunted. A lot of people are going after you as like, you're the top dog on their schedule. I'm fascinated to see how he uses that to keep this group super, super motivated all year long.
You look at kind of the way he came up, and coaching trees maybe a little bit different in college basketball than they are in college football, but he kind of comes from the Hurley pedigree, I suppose, just with the story behind how they helped him out a little bit early on, and just the way that those guys tend to run their programs. But when you compare Nate to the Hurleys, to Bill Self, to Sampson, to a lot of other successful college basketball coaches around the country, how does he stand out? What makes him different from what everybody else is doing?
Yeah, everything is NBA focused. I think that's one thing that I keep noticing, that with their roster building, with their way they run practices, with the way that they're trying to execute game plans offensively and defensively. He is ahead of the curve with Alabama's rim and 3 rate. He's been a champion of that for a long time, constantly leading the sport. And like, hey, we're going to take shots at the rim and we're going to take threes. And if we can avoid mid-range jumpers if possible, that's great. Even like to his detriment, right? Like Brandon Miller, doesn't take any of those mid-range shots a couple years ago at Alabama, then goes to the league and suddenly he's drilling every mid-range pull-up jumper. Like it's just, he had it in his bag, but he was able to convince a guy like that to buy into the system that they have. So I think his faith in like what we're doing and our process is really important. And also the willingness to change too, as well, that I think I've noticed. Like, last year they kind of went all in with this 5-out offense with Grant Nelson at the 5 for long stretches, and it just wasn't good enough defensively. And so like the ability to go into the portal this cycle, and we'll get into it later with some of the personnel, and find different options just to have like a little bit more pop on that end defensively, and finding that identity of what type of freshman we want to go after with these high feel guys that can actually play 2 ways. Some of that stuff shows a little bit of a evolving too, where it's like, hey, we can have our cake and we can also eat it too.
One of the things that really sticks out to me is you mentioned, some of the brain drain from, UConn and what they've been able to do, and, assistance from programs like Kansas and Houston and Duke and all these guys. They tend to spread out a little bit. When it comes to Alabama, they've had assistants, especially recently, leave for, lower tier head coaching jobs. But what strikes me as interesting, and I don't know if other coaches do this or not, but obviously I see Nate up close. He, instead of going to find like the next up and coming college assistant, it's like he reaches into the NBA and plucks some guys and brings them down, which, feeds into the whole everything is NBA focused. But also like that's like, is that rare? I mean, you cover basketball, college basketball at such a, grander scale than I do. Like that seems so unique to me.
No, it's just connections too. I think it's also just trying to find different voices. Hey, who can we find that we can hire? They hired Doc Rivers, prize assistant, to try to help fix this defense. Who can we find that brings in a different idea and a different addition for this, and throw a little bit of that? And it's like, I think sometimes you see some certain coaching staffs where it's like, hey, we all kind of believe the same thing. We have like the same ethos of like what we want our offense and defense to be. I think it's interesting that Nate's kind of picked and choose the little bits and pieces. Like, yeah, obviously he has an identity with the type of shot diet that he wants to take, but he's able to kind of get a lot of different ideas from different coaching staffs throughout the country. And so it's hard to find people that talk bad about Oates too. And the other thing that's like kind of interesting that I think is funny is like, there's so many, I feel like there's 2 aisles in college basketball coaching that's changing. There's like this older school approach versus there's this new school approach. And like Nate kind of came up in that old school ranks, so to speak, right? And he's pivoted to like this new era of college basketball where he's ahead of the curve at it. And, I think one thing that I've talked to a couple of people. It's like, if there's new trends that are coming to the sport, like Alabama is going to probably find it first. And that's something that's a little bit different than some of the other coaching staffs in this space.
Yeah, he kind of sets the pace in that regard. That's been really impressive to watch. Figure we could dig into the roster now. It's a really good roster, man. It's a really good roster. When I broke this up to chat with you about it, I kind of broke it up into, the key returners, guys like Mark Sears, Grant Nelson, Trelly, the key transfers, Chris Youngblood, Cliff Amore, Aiden Holloway, and then, obviously they star-studded freshman class came in. We'll break down each of those tiers. But first, when I look at this roster, I don't see a glaring weakness. When you look at this roster, what do you see, or what do you not see? What sticks out about the way Alabama has kind of constructed the 24-25 roster?
Well, I like the versatility that they have, especially in the front court. That's the one area of the floor that I'm really focused on. I think that the smart college basketball teams are trying to build offenses that have a 5-out option, and then also a guy who can be a rim runner and play kind of 4-out, 1-in, and to open up driving lanes and stuff like that. So you can space the floor a little bit, I think, with Jaron Stevenson and Grant Nelson when they're playing the 4 and the 5. And then you can have Amore as that starting 5-man, where it's like, hey, like if I'm that low man guarding ball screens, like I have to respect him flying down the rim because he is one of the best athletes on this roster who can just dunk all over everybody. So it's like, I just like the idea that they have built this where it can kind of come in different ways, especially with that front court. Like obviously having guards that have juice is great, and you want a lot of shooters on the floor, but those front courts that like have like multiple ways to play that they can tailor it against, they're going to see some really interesting defenses in non-conference play that will prepare them really well for the NCAA tournament. But having that positional flexibility up front is something that not a lot of teams have. Like, even Aiden Sherrill is like kind of an underrated guy that in this front court where like he's shooting it really, really well from 3 is what we've heard in preseason practices as well. So it's like, hey, we have 3 guys that we trust that can play the 4 or the 5 that can shoot it at a high level. And we have a rim runner. Like that type of stuff that flexibility is something that a lot of teams want to have, but Alabama actually has.
Yeah, well, and you hit on this too, that last year it was kind of offense or bust. Like when there were certain points of the NCAA tournament, and even certain points of the regular season where we thought Alabama's got to score 100. And even then the defense may not be there and they might give up 110, right? The defense this year seems to be, at least on paper, I don't want to say fixed, but it's going to be a lot better. Is it as simple as plug in Cliff, add water equals defense? Or what do you think is going to allow them a little bit more versatility or a little bit more efficient defensive performances just on that side of the ball?
Well, Cliff is the easiest one because we talk a lot about threes, but like the most efficient shot in basketball is still a layup or a dunk. And when Amore's on the floor, those don't happen. At Rutgers, I think teams shot just 50% at the rim when Amore was in the game. That was a big issue. The rim defense was a big issue for Alabama last year. It's going to be a strength this year when he's on the floor. But there's 2 other guys that I've really noticed as well. And it's weird. Like they're both freshmen. Like we're not supposed to count on these guys to be necessarily like dudes on the defensive end right away. But Darian Reed, the 5-star wing, is an unbelievable multi-positional defender that they just didn't really have. It felt like, sometimes when they played 3 small guards last year, it's like, all right, who are we putting on these big wings that are littered all over the SEC? I think Reed can give you that type of guy that can guard those different positions. And then LeBaron Philon, I think he's awesome, especially as an on-the-ball defender. And you see what his like attention to detail off the ball is as well. And he's got positional size at 6'4". So it's like you finally have a big guard at the point of attack, a big wing like Reed who can kind of guard multiple positions, and then a rim protector on the back end. Like that recipe, I think, is there for Alabama to have, a top 25 defense nationally. I think that might be the floor with this group. We'll see how it is like when they go with those 5-out offenses. But like the days of finishing outside the top 100, I don't think that's possible because of how good Amore is on the back end and some of the, additions that they've made, especially on the perimeter. And I didn't even bring up Chris Youngblood, who I think is super underrated defensively. Just like when he gets healthy, like he's 6'4", he's 225, like he's a brick house. Like he is hard to like really kind of get around him. He really chests up defender or drivers really, really well and stays in front. So I think their personnel defensively has gotten a lot better.
Yeah, no, Chris Youngblood's one of the many transfers that Alabama fans are really excited to see this season. Let's dig into the roster a little bit more. The key returners, right? Mark Sears, a walking 20 points a game. Grant Nelson, I thought, had a lot of good moments once he was able to finally, I think, adjust a little bit to some of that high major ball and just maybe the speed of the game a little bit. Had some foul issues, I think, in the midway point of last season. But, I mean, turned it on and played really, really well in the NCAA tournament. Latrell Wrightsell, one of the more efficient three-point shooters, I think, in the country, a little bit underrated. And then you've also got Mo Diabate, a hustle guy, and then Jaron Stevenson, a guy who can provide a lot of stuff. And I think Nate's looking for a little bit more consistency out of here this season. When you look at the returners, and I kind of wanted to point to something that you wrote not too long ago, you basically singled out Grant Nelson as for the potential for that year 2 jump. Why do you think he is going to play a lot better this year? Is it just a matter of getting adjusted to that high major ball, SEC ball, or what do you think is going to click for him this year?
No, it's a great point, because I think if you take out that North Carolina game and that UConn game last year for Grant Nelson, a lot of people would be like, yeah, he wasn't very good last year. Like like there were times there where it felt like Grant was really struggling as he kind of like adjusted from the Summit League, which is not known for his athleticism, to the SEC, which is the most athletic league in college basketball. So I think just his comfort, his understanding the speed of the game, the length of the game, all of the length on the floor, all of that stuff is going to matter. And I think getting him a real 5 like Amori will unlock a little bit of things for him and maybe simplify it a little bit more as well for him, because his playmaking at the 4, I thought was pretty good when they had Nick Pringle at the 5, whereas just like that rim runner who could just, throw down dunks. And if Nelson was getting, maybe he's like that mid post isolation where he backs him down a little bit and then he can find, a cutter or somebody in the dunker spot like Pringle. Like, I thought that was his best version of himself. And I think he can get back to more of that with Amori at the 5. So I think playing the 4 this year, kind of understanding what we need to be, I'm not going to assume that he makes a huge jump as a 3-point shooter. We have a 4-year sample size of him being in that 29 to 31% range, but we've seen other options like, Coleman Hawkins is one that he was in the portal this year from Illinois, who transferred to Kansas State. He was kind of in the same boat as Nelson for 3 years in a row. He was not really a great 3-point shooter. Then that 4th year, he just popped and suddenly shot 37% from 3. So if Nelson gets that, then we're talking about him as like one of the best players in the SEC.
I had to look up this stat. He had a stretch last year. I think it was just 11 games total where he had more fouls than field goals. So it was a wonky adjustment. But then when he flashed, it's just like, oh, okay, there it is. Like that's what Nate went after. And so I think another year in the system is probably just going to help him a ton, in addition to having Cliff there so he can play his more natural 4. So, because we saw all the good things that could happen, especially in the tournament last year when he's playing a little bit more of his natural position. When you look at some of the other returners, it's easy to kind of pencil in Mark Sears as like, okay, like this dude is everything. He means a lot to the state of Alabama. He means a lot to the program. Is there more that you think there is that he brought back when he decided to return, or is it just the leadership, the 20 points a game? Like what more is Alabama gaining with bringing a guy like Mark Sears back?
Yeah, I think when you get someone like him back, it just makes life easier for everybody else, because they know like what my role is. And like, they know, hey, it's late clock situation. The ball's probably going to be in Mark's hands. And like, when you have that freedom of knowing that like we have a guy, that makes life just so much easier. It's like, I'm getting the shots that I'm better at. I know I can play a little bit harder defensively because maybe I don't have to carry such a big load offensively. But, the thing is with Mark, it's twofold. I love his ability to get to the free throw line. Like his ability to get pressure on the rim is really, really special. Like Alabama wants to talk a lot about threes, but their best shots are when they get paint touches that kick out for threes. And Sears is a huge part of that with his constant rim pressure. And then too, like the way he's changed his game, it's really cool. Like he used to be a guy that took a lot more of those off the dribble tough twos. And now, like, he's changed his game where that's not a part of his shot diet at all at Alabama. So it's a very, very impressive rise for him to understand, hey, what am I good at? What's Alabama good at? And how can we marry those two things together? And I think him coming back, like, I thought Hubert Davis had a really interesting quote when he was talking about RJ Davis. He was like, hey, if RJ wants to just copy and paste the season he had last year into this year, I'd be fine. I think Alabama would feel the same way about Mark Sears. Just copy and paste what you did last year. We'll take it.
There were points last year where he would just, he'd get the ball at the top of the key, or he'd, off the corner or whatever, and he'd fire up and launch. And it's just like, it's going in. It's going in, because he just, I don't know. He was just, I don't want to say he was automatic, because he had a couple of, poor shooting games, but they were so few and far between that as soon as he'd go up, it's like, that's 3, turn the other way. Right. Like I don't know. He's been just so good and so consistent, I think is probably the word I would best use to describe what he did last year.
And then like you randomly look up and he has 12 free throw attempts in a game. It's like, how? Like it's just like they were capable. It's just barrage. Now the one thing with him too, I think there's been a huge point of emphasis with that staff and him of like, hey, we got to be a pest defensively. And so I think also like that's like the area of the game where we could see him potentially take another step because you're a 5th-year senior now. Like you've seen all the coverages, all the offenses. Like what a lot of teams are going to run. You're really comfortable. This is year 3 in the SEC. Like you've seen most of these teams a ton. I think that's an area where if you could see, Mark really elevate, could be like with his on the ball defense and just like, hey, like we're going to play a lot of drop coverage with Cliff Amore on the floor where he's just going to be sagging in the middle of the paint. If I just refuse to get screened, I'm going to get skinny, and I'm literally refusing to get screened. And if that's my role and I'm making threes, there's room in the NBA for me if I'm doing those two things at a high level.
In the exhibition against Memphis not too long ago, he had 3 steals, it was fun, but he was also, you could just tell he's taking that to heart. He's being kind of a pest on the ball. He's being, I'm going to get in your face. I'm going to make you earn every dribble, drive, shot you take. We'll see if that ultimately translates over the course of the entire season. I think the other thing too with Mark Sears, just last point on him, his leadership abilities, if that's what he's doing in an exhibition, it means he's probably doing it in practice, which means everybody else is going to follow his lead. And that's what Nate wants when it comes to improving their defensive efficiency is just, if you get the top domino or the top dog to do it, everything else falls into place because everybody's going to follow his lead.
And like, let's be honest too, if you're looking at Alabama, you're going to try to go after the weakest link. If you're like going to try to pick at him, and if Sears is the weakest link, then all of a sudden he's like, I'm not anymore. That kind of changes the math equation as well.
4 transfers in for Alabama this season. Cliff Amore from Rutgers, Chris Youngblood from South Florida, Aiden Holloway from Auburn. Iron Bowl of basketball is going to be really interesting because he's primed to play a lot of minutes this year, as well as Houston Millette from Pepperdine. Of those 4, who are you most excited to watch with Alabama this season?
Well, Youngblood is one of my favorite players. He was like my favorite fits in this portal cycle, just because we have a huge volume of him making a ton of threes, and he is more than just a 3-point shooter. Like you see the ability to pass a little bit. He had a good assist to turnover ratio. They could post him up against some small guards. That's one thing I noticed too. When you kind of look up and down these SEC rosters, there's 13 of 16 SEC teams are going to start someone who's 6'2" or smaller. If you're looking for isolation basketball a little bit, Youngblood posting up some of those small guys, okay, we're going to go play, for example, we're going to go play Kentucky. Hey, Kirk Kriisa, you're going to go get matched up against Youngblood, and he's 40 pounds bigger than you, and he's going to take you onto the block. And if you can't double team him, he's going to score right over you. That ability just to add little differentials to this offensive ecosystem is smart. And I think too, mid-range jumpers are not a good shot for Alabama, but they're a good shot when Chris Youngblood takes them. He shoots over 50% on those type of middle of the floor jumpers. So if you have to take it, worst case scenario, Youngblood could be that type of guy. So all of these transfers are going to help them in different ways. I think you look at Houston Millette as get out in transition and make threes for us. Aiden Holloway, same type of thing. Get out in transition, be a gunner for us. We're going to simplify your role this year where maybe we don't need you to be a set the table point guard. Let's just go be a shooter. That helps. Amore, rim run, dunk, catch lobs, guard really well one-on-one defensively against these bigs that are in the SEC. Give us a little bit of different coverages that we can play against pick and rolls. Maybe you don't need to dribble it all the time. Maybe we don't have to throw the ball to you a ton, but if you just exist, you're probably going to get 12 to 14 points because there's so much emphasis on stopping our guards. That's the type of aspect where I think these transfers all make sense because they're all a little bit different and they add, really key depth too.
The thing that maybe sticks out about this transfer class is that just it seems like Nate went out, pulled these guys in, and it just raised the floor of the entire operation. They're going to play a little bit more smoothly. They could do a lot more stuff. You talked about the versatility of a lot of these guys, and just they bring in different types of experience. Holloway brings in that SEC experience. Youngblood is in he's in his 5th year, 3rd stop. He's just played a lot of ball. Cliff played in the Big Ten, and I know Rutgers wasn't world beaters, but when he was there, they did really, really well defensively. Houston Millette has taken 1 million 3-point shots in his career. That's the floor got higher with this Alabama team. And not to disparage some of the guys that may have left or some, part of last year's team, but there were times where there was a little bit of a drop off. And I don't know that there's going to be as big of a drop off when you go from the 1s to the 2s because of who they were able to bring in.
You're literally bringing 5-stars in off the bench. Who would start for probably 50 other high major teams. There's haves and there's have-nots in college basketball, and the gap is growing, and Alabama is clearly part of the haves right now.
Well, that's a good transition into the freshman class, right? There's 4 guys that Nate Oates signed to bring in. You've got LeBaron Philon, 4-star guy, Aiden Sherrill, 4-star guy, Nas Cunningham, another 4-star guy, and then Darian Reed, you mentioned him, 5-star guy. All of these guys were in the top 45, I believe, of 24/7's 2024 class. Who do you think is going to have the biggest impact of those 4 true freshmen this season?
I would have told you Reed a few weeks ago, but I've changed my mind. I think it's Philon. I love this kid. He is somebody that I've just continued to grow on as, I come on to the high school ranks a little bit later than some of our recruiting guys because they get to see him so much. I'm focused on the season, and in the summer, I'm spending all my time basically trying to catch up on these freshmen. And I loved Philon. I thought that he was awesome, and I liked the idea of playing him at the 1 and really, getting Sears off the ball a little bit more. I think a little bit of like that Aaron Estrada role last year where like you could kind of turn Sears into more of a scorer and a creator at times, but he's here really more on the floor to score. I think Philon can help them do that. And we've seen in the exhibitions, like he is a 2-way player already. Like we've seen the 2-way aspect of it, his ability to push in transition. He's making threes. He gets into the paint whenever he wants. I don't think he's necessarily like the most twitchy athlete, but he's a really good athlete as well. And like the ability just to get in the middle of the paint and make plays off of that, like you're drawing 2 defenders to the ball, you're opening catch and shoot threes, you're opening lobs, like you're competing on the defensive end. Like he just has it. He has it. And I would love if Alabama could get him back for a year or 2, but I'm afraid he might be too good. It might be a one and done. Like that's like the first world problem that you have right now. But Reed is also really good as well. I think Reed is going to be a rotation staple as well. I could see him easily being a one and done type of contender as well, just with the defense, the playmaking. I think you see times with him where he can, I don't know if I trust his jumper quite yet, but I like the playmaking that he has for it. And the court coverage defensively is just nuts. Like he gets everywhere all the time, plays really, really hard. So I think those 2 guys probably play the most minutes. For me, like I don't see a role for Cunningham right now. It just feels like if somebody's going to probably be on the outside looking in, I think he would probably be that one. But even Sherrill, like the fact that you can shoot it at 6'10" means you have a chance to play. And if Alabama is looking for a little bit of rim defense and also some shooting when Amori's not on the floor, maybe Sherrill's the better option than, maybe moving Grant Nelson to the 5.
Nate had said, he said a lot of stuff when we were able to talk to him before their season opener. He said, one, Nas might be a candidate for a potential red shirt this year, just a guy that just may not have a role, and there's only so many minutes and so many shots to take during the course of the game, right? And so it may make sense for him to maybe bulk up a little bit, preserve a red shirt, and then start really contributing a little bit more next year. He said that Sherrill and Reed both probably going to be in the rotation in some capacity. Just, they're going to have a few games here and there where they can experiment a little bit with some lineups just to kind of see what works. But the point on Philon, a couple of thoughts here. One, this dude, Nate already called him one of the best 2-way guards in college basketball, which is insane to think about because he was only considered like the number 33 overall player in the class. But we've seen bits and pieces of it. I was in Huntsville to watch them play Memphis. He went 17-7-5. He also had a steal, had a couple turnovers here and there, but the dude looks the part. And the second thought is, I grew up in Kansas City, watched a lot of Kansas, K-State, Missouri, right? The fact that Kansas just kind of let this guy go and they're like, you know what, we're okay. And they're routinely the team that's either like on the same level or, preseason number 1 over Alabama, maybe says a lot about how good Kansas is going to be this year. But all of that to say, I'm very excited to watch Philon play a little bit more in more meaningful games this year because he just looks like he's got the stuff, man.
I think Kansas is going to regret that decision because just based on what the last decision is, I think they're going to regret it because Philon is an absolute dude. And the thing is too, it's just like I kind of went in being like, okay, he's probably going to play off the bench. Maybe they can find a role for him. And now I'm like, how do you take him out of the starting lineup? Like I don't know how that happens. Like he looks like one of their best 5 players right now. And I can't believe I'm saying that, but he like genuinely, like as I watched a couple of those exhibitions, like Sears is obviously better. And obviously there's some guys with maybe a little bit higher ceiling, but Philon was one of the players that really stood out to me, maybe the most, and kind of caught my eye and is probably my favorite player on the roster right now. So like we all get obsessed with the shiny new toys, and I'm absolutely one there like to feel that way as well. But Philon's up there for me. I think he's going to be one of the most impactful freshmen in the SEC, and I think he's going to make a real run at SEC Freshman of the Year.
I heard this first from Coach Saban, but I know a lot of coaches use this, force us to play you. It seems like Philon's going to make Nate play him this year. Alabama's schedule, I'm sure you've seen this, And part of this includes the SEC, which has done a tremendous job just elevating its overall profile in recent years. But Alabama's schedule, even by those standards, you ready for this? They play 18 teams that played in the 2024 NCAA tournament. They play 13 teams that are ranked currently in the AP preseason top 25. That includes 6 teams that made the Sweet 16 last season in Illinois, North Carolina, Houston, Purdue, Creighton, Tennessee. Is Nate a psychopath?
He is a psychopath. Also, one thing I'd like to note too, look at all the mid-majors that they're playing. It's UNC Asheville, who's awesome. It's Arkansas State, who's the Alabama of the Sun Belt. And it's McNeese, who is one of the best mid-major programs out there under Will Wade, who has like a high major roster. So like
I think the last team they announced was South Dakota State. They're routinely a tournament team, right? Like that's where I forget his name, Iowa State coach Otzelberger, he built that program up before he bounced back to Ames. Like insane non-con schedule.
It is. And so, yes, Oates is a psychopath, but there is a reason behind all of these things. And it's because of the different, I think the biggest thing is like the different styles that you're going to see in a short time frame that will really help you in March when it's like, hey, we're playing 2 teams in basically 36 to 48 hours, and they could be drastically different. And so like, I talk a lot about like the aggressive versus passive defenses that we see in college basketball. Like Alabama's going to see both. Houston is super, super aggressive. Like they want to trap literally everything. And they're maybe the most aggressive defense in college basketball. And Creighton is the most passive defense in college basketball. They don't want to turn you over at all. They want to play, like they want to make this into a jump shot game. Like they're never going to let you get shots at the rim, but you can take as many mid-range jumpers as you want. We're not going to try to turn you over. We're not super physical, but we'll play the finesse game with you. So you're going to see 2 wildly different things. You know, Illinois and Rutgers have like 2, big time freshmen. Illinois has Kasparis Yakishonis and Will Riley, who are both potential first round picks. Rutgers has 2 5-stars with Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper. So you're going to see that. Purdue has maybe the best point guard in college basketball, and Braden Smith as like a set the table guy who is an awesome, awesome player. North Carolina has RJ Davis, maybe a best player in the country as well. Like you just see up and down, like you're going to see different things. Like North Carolina wants to play super, super fast. Illinois wants to play super, super fast. I think Purdue could play really slow this year. So it's like, that's like all of these little challenges and like tweaks. Notre Dame, I think, could play really slow this year as well. Like all of those challenges and tweaks that you're going to see from these teams in non-conference play really give you like the pick of the litter, where it's like, hey, when we're going into March and we're playing, the Sweet 16 game and the Elite 8 game, and they're 2 completely opposite teams, like we have a proof of concept. We're like, oh, hey, in November, we had that stretch where we played Illinois, who's going to be the leading team in tempo, and Houston, who's going to play like one of the slowest teams in the country. They're
going to see a lot of different looks. It's going to get them prepared for, they'll be ready come March, right? And that's a really good point. The other point I wanted to point out about, I know I had mentioned with the SEC, they have 3 different 7-day stretches where they play 3 games. You ready for this? In January, at A&M, Ole Miss at home, at Kentucky. In February, they're at Arkansas, at Texas, home against Auburn. And then they end the regular season at Tennessee, Florida at home, at Auburn. I'm using this as a way to set you up to discuss the SEC, because when people think SEC, they think football. I think there's a lot of people in this part of the country too that also think baseball. But basketball has really taken a step up in recent years. There's a lot of really good teams in this league, man.
You go up and down these rosters, and like you could make a case that like some of them are the best rosters that these programs have ever had. Now, part of that is the NIL era. There's just extra money. The SEC is the best basketball conference in the country this year. They have passed the Big 12, I think, and it really comes down to like I look at Georgia. They're like picked 12th or 13th. Best roster they've ever had with a 5-star and Asa Newell coming in. Mississippi State has one of its best rosters that they've ever had. Florida has reloaded in a big way. Arkansas and Kentucky, they're going to be compared constantly with what they have. But, I think if you look at it from like a national title contender perspective, it's Auburn, it's Alabama, and Tennessee. I think all 3 of those teams are going to head into this year being like, hey, we're top 12-ish teams in the country. We think we can win it all on that first Monday in April. And then there's Texas A&M, who's super old. Texas got a 5-star in Trey Johnson and a ton of great, high potent scores out of the portal. Arkansas and Kentucky have loaded rosters. Ole Miss, Chris Beard, we've seen huge jumps from his programs in year 2. Ole Miss has gone into the portal and added big-time players like Sean Padula, Dre Davis, they get Matt Morrell back, they get Jamin Brakefield back. Like that team's going to be way, way better. So, Missouri, I didn't even mention them. I think they're going to be one of the most improved teams in college basketball this year. They went 0-19 against SEC teams last year. They go into the portal. They get Tony Perkins, who averaged 15 points a game at Iowa. They get Mark Mitchell, who is a former 5-star, who I think is going to be, an awesome player for them, probably average close to 15 to 17 points a game this year. Like they're going to be way better. So you look up and down this group, like I'm not really in on LSU this year. I think they would be my pick to finish last. And even they have a really decent roster where it's like, yeah, that's not going to be like a total like cakewalk. So that's the type of challenge that you're really walking into when it's Alabama, when you could make a case like, yeah, there's some teams that are down. And I think that there's, Oklahoma doesn't necessarily have the NIL money, and LSU doesn't necessarily have that elite NIL money that some of these other teams have. South Carolina, I wouldn't say has elite NIL money compared to its, some of these counterparts. But for the most part, for the rest of them, like these rosters are some of the most expensive in college basketball, and they look like it too, because they just got dudes everywhere.
Someone who grew up in the middle of Big 12 country, and then I spent a lot of time in Big 10 country. For you to say that the SEC has passed the Big 12 in basketball, we're in for a fun winter, man. Like there's going to be a lot of really good ball played up close. I'm excited for this Alabama schedule, not just the non-con, but obviously I feel like you're just going to be playing a jackhammer every single night when you're in the SEC. Like it is going to be that type of schedule for Alabama. Last thing, Isaac, that I wanted to get from you before we head out here. Obviously, highly anticipated season for Alabama. A lot of experts, including yourself, picking them to contend. Some are even picking Alabama to win the national championship. We were talking earlier about how Jerry Palm already has them as the number 1 overall seed. I'm curious, though. We know how random March can be. We know how fickle that tournament can be, right? Alabama, just a couple years ago, number 1 overall seed, lost in the Sweet 16. Right? Very rarely does a team like UConn come along where they're just the buzzsaw of all buzzsaws and just cut right through the tournament. I'm curious, this Alabama team, as talented as they are, as good as they look on paper, as good as we both believe that they're going to be this season, what's a realistic, successful season you think for them this winter?
I think you have to, a realistic, successful season would be winning the SEC. I don't think you could put a roster like this together, not win the SEC and be like, wow, we had a great year. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the type of like standard that they're up to, where it's like, hey, we want to compete to win this league. And then you just give yourself another bite at the apple in March. Like, I really hate putting like those expectations on teams where it's like, hey, if you don't get to the Final Four, it's a disappointing season. But it kind of feels like that with this group. And I think, again, what I'm kind of focused on is I want to bet on the teams that can score in multiple ways and at elite level. I think this year, last year, 3 of the top 4 offenses in the sport heading into the big dance made the Final Four. I think this year will be some part of the same. Like, I think Alabama and Gonzaga, like those 2 teams would be my pick to meet in the national title game if I had to right now, because I think those 2 are the best 2 offenses in the sport. So if you can score, that gives you an edge up, especially when you have all of these old dudes in retention and, a decent transfer portal. An awesome transfer portal class, and then awesome 5-stars coming in too. So I have Alabama to advance the national championship game. That, though, I just don't want to put it out there as like, hey, if they don't, like, it's a failure, because basketball is weird and sometimes shots just don't go in weird games. Like, you could have an awesome season that ends in the Elite Eight, and sure, it'll be disappointing. That doesn't mean like, hey, we went 30-2 this year, and like that, this is a failure. You know what I mean?
The more I look at this team and the more that I kind of see, what they could potentially do this year. And then I remember what last year was like, right? Like, there was a lot of frustrating, head scratching performances in January and February. And then obviously they went one and done at the SEC tournament, but then they got their act together, right? They took advantage of a good draw, won a couple of tough games in LA, and got all the way to the Final Four. For me, get back to the Final Four, man. You have a more talented roster this year. I'd like to think that Nate is going to know how to put the puzzle together. If you can at least match what you did last year, I think that goes down as a thumbs up in my book. Because also, if you're able to match what you did last year, like, people forget, as good as UConn was last year, that was 56-56, 8 minutes into the second half, right? So now I'd like to think that they've got the horses to maybe finish out a game like that against another top tier opponent like that. So we'll see what happens, but at least put yourself in position. I think another Final Four run would be a thumbs up for Alabama in my book this season. I don't know. That's just one man's opinion. I'm a wrestling guy, not a basketball guy. So that's at least what comes to mind. So I don't know. That's just, it's because it's so hard to say, yeah, they got to win it or they're done. We've seen that how many years with football. And yes, they just came off of a 17-year reign with Nick Saban where they won a national championship, at least one national championship every 3 years. That's a hard ask in basketball, I think.
Especially in the portal era, where I think a lot more teams are a lot more competent. And the NIL era where it's like, hey, it's just such a smaller thing. Like there's 85 guys on the college football roster compared to 13 or 14 in basketball. It's just a little bit different. This SEC is going to be a bear. I think you're going to have times where Alabama, I think teams are going to go at them physically and see if they're up to the challenge on that end and kind of try to punch them into the mouth. But there's no doubt, like, I think this is closer to a finished product than they were last year. They were really tinkering a lot last year. I think this group has a chance to really hit the ground running right away. And it's not going to be a situation where Alabama's like, has 8 losses in the middle of February. I just don't foresee that scenario being, legit, even with a schedule that is brutal.
100%. Crimson Tide kickoff, or I guess tip off, their 24-25 season against UNC Asheville on Monday, November 4th, 8 p.m. start time at Coleman Coliseum in Tuscaloosa. That game's on ESPNU. Isaac, appreciate you coming on Roll Pod to discuss the Tide.
Thanks for having me. Anytime.
Big thank you to Isaac for coming on today's show. I think I only asked him for like 30-ish minutes, and we ended up going for almost close to 45. So you can tell he's excited for this Alabama basketball team. I'm excited for this season. It's going to be a lot of fun this year. Again, Crimson Tide tip-off the 2024 season against UNC Asheville in Tuscaloosa on Monday, tomorrow, November 4th. Going to start at 8 p.m. Games on ESPNU if you cannot get to Tuscaloosa. But that's all we've got for today's show, guys. We'll be back probably on Tuesday to begin discussions about Alabama LSU. Really big football game coming up in Baton Rouge this coming week. In the meantime, though, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 24/7 Sports. The month of November is such a hectic time on the sports calendar, guys, with football still playing meaningful games this month and still making a potential playoff push. Basketball obviously beginning their season as well. We're going to make sure that we do our best to keep tabs on everything, and I don't want you guys to miss a thing. You can find a link to subscribe in the show notes. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening. We'll talk to y'all again soon.